Hi, I'm Lydia Howell, and I'm a programmer at KFAI Radio in Minneapolis, Minnesota, producer, host of Catalyst, Politics and Culture. And I'm having a conversation with Rocky Anderson. He's a former mayor of Salt Lake City, 2 terms, has done an amazing amount of things in his life in the law, public policy, on a variety of issues. And he's running for president in 2012. Welcome to KFAI.
It's great to be here and really good to be back to Minnesota.
All right. Well, one place to start is that you did a lot of work around economic development as mayor and had really thought about issues. And since the economy is the #1 issue for voters right now, I think that's something it would be interesting to hear, your perspective around the economy and what we face as a country.
Well, when you're mayor, you realize that's where the impacts are felt. Tip O'Neill once said that all politics is local. It's absolutely true in terms of the impacts. But on the other hand, we need good federal public policy. And we're not getting it. And we're not getting it because of the corrupting influence of money in our government, pure and simple. The public interest has been completely betrayed. So you cannot talk about the economy right now without recognizing that we have the greatest disparity in wealth and income between a small elite class of the economic aristocracy and all of the rest of us since the 1920s. It's never been this bad. And it's getting worse. And it's gotten worse under President Obama. And you also can't talk about the economy without recognizing that Wall Street has completely had its way with the White House and with Congress, and it doesn't matter if it's the Democrats or Republicans. They've both been feeding at the trough of special interest money, and much of that has been driven by Wall Street. And these folks from Wall Street that come in, and they were there during the Clinton administration, during the Bush administration, and now during the Obama administration. The same people that created the problems are there now, supposedly responding to them, and it's clear to everybody they're just making it all worse.
Yeah, well, the DoddFrank bill left a bunch of loopholes. You could drive a Mack truck through with all your credit default swaps, spilling out the back end.
Unbelievable. How many people understand this? I would refer anybody to last month's Rolling Stone piece by Matt Taibbi about how DoddFrank was completely watered down. I mean, look at what we have. There's still no reserve requirements for credit default swaps. And to understand that, all you have to understand is that companies are selling basically insurance. If folks are buying these derivative products and they want protection against losses, they go to companies like AIG, they pay premiums, and AIG says, we'll cover you if you suffer losses. But since the Clinton administration and legislation that was passed then, the Commodities Modernization Act, Commodities Futures Modernization Act of 2000, and by the way, that came about, it was sponsored by Senator Phil Gramm, whose wife was on the board of Enron, which wanted to deal in these perverse instruments. But anyway,
and Enron
so that's
crashed
how,
and burned. I mean,
so that's how
all
it all
this stuff
happens.
is overwhelming to people where they don't even understand what a lot of the terms you're using are. I mean, but the main thing is to understand that Wall Street, big banks, major multinationals, they get these special privileges, and that Phil Gramm from my home state of Texas, a Republican, wrote this bill, but President Bill Clinton, a Democrat, signed it into law. Bipartisan.
Upon the advice of Larry Summers, his Treasury Secretary, who President Obama brings back in as his chief economic advisor. Now, how does that happen if we're really serious about preventing these kinds of meltdowns again, this kind of raping and pillaging of the American public by the Wall Street banks? We still, after all of this time, have banks that are too big to fail.
Well, Jamie
Why are we not
Dimon was
breaking
just
those up?
in Congress this week.
Exactly.
And it almost seemed at times...
$2 billion loss, maybe $5 billion loss.
So in your view, part of the reason that the economy is stalled out for everyday Americans is directly related to all these issues of Wall Street run amok and too big to fail banks.
And it all comes down to the corrupting influence of money. President Obama received more money from Wall Street for his last campaign than any candidates ever received in this nation's history. Well, is it any wonder that all of this massive fraud that took place, selling these derivative instruments with all these toxic mortgages, that many of them weren't worth the paper they were written on, selling them as AAA investments to pension plans? Many of them lost up to a third of their value. These are working men and women counting on their pensions. And so it has this tremendous human impact, disastrous, tragic human impact. And these elite people among the financial aristocracy continue to have their way. And we need to change this. The people of this country can make certain that it changes, but not by simply doing the same thing we've always done, and that is voting for Republican or Democrat and moving them around within this corrupt, perverse system that we have.
Well, and the other thing is that we're, that's on the agenda in terms of the economy is budgets and workers, and what workers make somehow seems to be always on the chopping block, and yet the CEO's salaries seem to have, they're unlimited by anything. And yet, as we saw in Wisconsin, battling around public workers, somehow it's everyday working people that are being told to, take the cuts. And, how do you see that?
They do take the cuts. We've had enormous profit taking by the corporate sector over more than the last decade. All of the benefits have gone to the top 1%. The CEOs now making multiples of 300 or more times what working people are receiving. And wages for working men and women and their families have remained stagnant all this time, while CEO compensation is off the chart. So, and it's interesting, these folks that basically represent the interests of the CEOs, and those are the people that receive their contributions to get elected to Congress and the White House, they say, oh, don't talk about that. That's class warfare. Well, class warfare has been going on for a long, long time, and the victims of it are the ones that these folks point at and say, oh, don't talk about that. That's class warfare.
Meaning the victims are everyday people.
Absolutely. Families throughout this country, and frankly the ramifications have been around the world, have suffered tremendously because of all of this. And this administration isn't really doing anything to fix it. We still have banks too large to fail. And by the way, it's not just people like me that are calling for it. The Dallas branch of the Federal Reserve, considered probably the most conservative branch in the Federal Reserve, just issued a report a couple of months ago calling for breaking up the banks that are too large to fail. We still have no reserve requirements, so these folks can be selling this phony insurance with no reserves to back it up, and then once everything goes to hell again, they're going to come back and ask the government, as AIG did, gee, won't you give us all these billions of dollars so that we can pay off what we promised these people we'd pay them? And you know who the largest recipient of that money was? Goldman Sachs. And yet, who does President Obama have surrounding him? All of these folks from Goldman Sachs that end up coming in. It's this revolving door from the industry to government back to industry, and their pockets are filled. They're raking in the multi-millions of dollars, while all of us are standing by scratching our heads wondering, how does this happen? Lydia, it happens because the American people haven't stood up to it, and it's time that we do that. It's time that we say no more to this system, no more to support for the Republicans and Democrats who have brought us this plutocracy, government of, by, and for the wealthy, and it's time that we assert our rights as citizens to a government that represents our interests.
You've been listening to Rocky Anderson, former Salt Lake City mayor, 2 terms, running for the President of the United States in the 2012 You want to find out more about him, check out the website, voterocky.org. We're having a conversation with Rocky Anderson, running for president 2012, former mayor of Salt Lake City. Jobs, jobs, jobs. That's what people are really concerned about. And
well, I wish more people were concerned about it.
Regular people are damn concerned about it.
Regular people are concerned. It seems that those who are in power, Republicans and Democrats alike, are focused on all of the wrong things instead of taking care of this recession and getting people back to work.
How would Rocky Anderson, as president, put people back to work?
It's so clear, Lydia. We've been shipping millions of jobs overseas. Knock it off. It all started with President Clinton. These trade agreements have continued through. Now President Obama's administration is negotiating this ridiculous pact that would allow a sort of a secret court to override American sovereignty when it comes to laws that protect employees, that protect our environment. These trade agreements are so subversive.
The secret pact. This sounds like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, on steroids.
Yeah, it is. Exactly. That's a great description of it. But look at NAFTA. It absolutely burned working men and women and their families and much of the future of this country. Because if we don't have a strong middle class in this country, we're going to lose our competitive edge in so many ways, including the kind of educational system that we need. But what would I do? I'd renegotiate trade agreements, make certain that there's fair trade, so that those who employ American workers are on a more even keel with those who employ people in other nations at a fraction of the cost, but without the labor protections and without the environmental protections. And I would absolutely do away with these courts that are created under these trade agreements that can override American legislatures, either our Congress or state legislatures. So bring more jobs back to this country, provide tax incentives for American companies and companies owned by those elsewhere to employ people in the United States. Did you know that China imposes charges on American-made goods of 10 times what we impose for Chinese-made goods coming into this country? Why do we do that? I mean, the customs, it's just unbelievable.
Upside down. It's really upside down.
And at a time when we have we're living through this recession, so many people are suffering from unemployment. Secondly, we saw a hugely successful program under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Works Progress Administration, WPA. It was a great investment. They employed some 8 million people. They build up this nation's infrastructure. Ours is rapidly deteriorating. There's very little being done to fix it. My high school was a WPA project. It's still there, still serving the community, something that people are very proud of. Alumni just pumped in $9 million to renovate the school. It's ranked the 3rd most beautiful high school in the country, a WPA project. And why is it so beautiful? It's because they put great craftspeople to work, great masons. It's very intricate. The building of it, the wood inlay in the auditorium, in the classrooms, it's amazing what
and I'd invite the listeners out there, look around your town, and you're going to find that there's WPA stuff. Maybe it's a bridge. Maybe it's elements of beautiful buildings in your parks. Maybe it's public city buildings. I mean, or libraries. But the WPA is around everywhere. And so what you're suggesting is we revive the WPA.
Absolutely.
Again, to
it was a
rebuild.
huge success. Why are we not doing that? I think we're not doing it because this really isn't on the radar of this administration, of Congress. These aren't the kinds of things that they're willing to grapple with and put people to work, and at the same time build our nation's infrastructure, repair our nation's infrastructure. When I came in as mayor, our city's infrastructure had been ignored for a long time. You know, it comes budget time and everybody's arguing about all these other pet programs, and so it's easy to put aside investment in infrastructure and leave it for another day. It's totally irresponsible, but it's easy for these public policy makers to do. Well, our city council, and this is before I was mayor, said, we're going to set a target, and into the future, let's invest, I think it was 23% of our general fund in our budget into infrastructure repair and development. And that was tough to do. I think we accomplished it every year I was mayor, and it made such a difference because our focus was there. We had those goals. Why are we not doing that as a nation? Why don't we inventory what we need for our nation's infrastructure, both repair and new infrastructure, and then put people to work? And you can finance it. Hell, just put in place a financial transactions tax of 0.5%. You'd reduce speculation, reckless speculation, and including in commodities that are driving up the prices of necessities, including food around the world. Put in place a transaction tax, cut military spending, end these wars, and invest it in the American people and our infrastructure. That's the kind of thing, as we're spending money, and a lot of this is on the credit card in our children's names and later generations who are going to have to pay it off, they'll be getting something great in return for these investments.
Right. People get jobs now, but for generations to come, you have this infrastructure that we can all use and enjoy. What about labor? I want to wrap up this segment with talking about labor because it's, as you've said, it's taken hits. It just seems like the Republican Party is adamantly against labor, and the Democratic Party is willing to take labor's money during election time and volunteer labor to get out the vote. But then once Democrats are elected,
they vote for NAFTA.
Yeah, or they just leave unions twisting in the wind.
That's
right.
The
Free Choice Act, was totally left on the shelf once Barack Obama was elected.
Well, that's because it's a cynical political calculation that these folks in the Democratic Party figure that these people, labor unions, working men and women, have nowhere else to go, so they can be ignored, and then they go out and do the bidding of Wall Street and bring in all their money for their campaigns and bring in all of their people to make economic policy. It's been such a betrayal, not only of working men and women, not only of the unions, but of this nation's future. Because if we don't have a strong middle class, I mean, we went from the Gilded Age, where there's this huge disparity between a few wealthy people and all the rest who were having a hard time making it, to a strong middle class, progressive tax rate that meant that the very wealthy might have to get rid of a yacht or two. And then now we're going back to that Gilded Age. We're going backwards in so many ways. One thing that made such an enormous difference for over 3.5 decades in building this thriving, healthy middle class and an economy that was really working for just about everybody was the strength of unions.
So will Rocky Anderson be a friend to labor if you were in the White House?
Of course.
Would you strengthen American workers' rights to organize
Absolutely.
On their jobs?
Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't reforms that needed to be made in unions. Not all of them. I mean, some of them they had some problems. But by and large, look at what they brought to this country. The security for working men and women, the increase in wages. And those increases didn't just inure to the benefit of union members. It had this ripple effect where everybody was in the middle class was doing better.
It's true. And it's also, you can still see that today. I challenge anybody. Again, I'm from Texas, spent my first 30 years there, a so-called right-to-work state. And let me tell you, all I had to do was move north to Minnesota, stay with a long union history. My wages went up 25% for the same job.
Yeah, and
it's about, when you don't have that kind of balancing between workers and employers, then the workers tend to get the short end of the stick.
And it's not just a matter of absolute wages, how people are doing, but it's a matter of relativity as well. We had a much more democratized economy where CEOs were making more than working men and women, but not at these obscene levels now where it's like a 300 or more to 1 ratio. There's no other country in the world with these kinds of outrageous ratios between CEO pay and everybody else. And that, in large part, also is a product of the diminishment of the power of unions in this country. And we need to do whatever we can to help strengthen the rights of working men and women. Part of that is a stronger union movements. Part of it is simply making sure that we have policymakers that have their eye on not just the short-term political ramifications and this nonsense that deficit spending all of a sudden is so important to Republicans who said it didn't really matter. Dick Cheney said that deficits don't matter during the Bush administration. Senator Bob Bennett from Utah said deficits don't matter. Then we get a Democratic president, all of a sudden it's like everything that they can talk about is deficits. It's so twisted because you want to look at who brought on the deficits or the condition for those deficits. Primarily the Republicans. George Bush was the king of deficits. And look at the economic meltdown that's put us in the situation to begin with. So we can do this as a nation. If we'll recognize what it is that brought us out of that initial Gilded Age, what it is that's moved us in to a new Gilded Age, and what we can do to really make a difference for working men and women. A WPA program, renegotiation of our trade agreements would go a long, long ways. But also having leadership that conveyed to this nation that those in positions of power really care.
Right.
And also it's so important to recognize these changes in our economy and what's happening to people. It's not some kind of natural phenomenon. It's all a matter of public policy and what those in elective office do with respect to those in
who are they representing?
Class.
Are they representing the majority of Americans or a sliver of kind of a corporate elite? And
we know the answer to that.
Well, we ought to know it by now.
And it's because that's who's paying their way. They know where their bread is buttered.
Follow the money. Follow the money.
Yep.
We've been having a conversation with Rocky Anderson, former mayor of Salt Lake City, running for president 2012. You want to know more about his experiences as mayor and elsewhere, and his positions on issues, go to voterocky.org.